Thank you. All right, so again, this is the Accessibility Basics webinar, and I'm Jess Thompson with the State Board for Community and Technical Colleges. So before we get started, some housekeeping. Live captions are available, and you can access the live captions through a short URL, and that's bit.ly/SBCTCLIVE, and Monique has also pasted that link into the chat if you're able to access the chat. And also, as I mentioned before, if you have any audio problems, there is a call-in option available. So if you can keep that number on hand, that was also sent in the webinar reminder to your email in case you don't have a chance to write it down. But again, that phone number is 415-655-0002, and that access code is 926-162-149. So it looks like some people might need that. I'm seeing a couple chat things pop up asking me to talk, but again, trying not to look at the chat. And if you have any other troubleshooting, the lovely Monique Belair is here to help. And her email address is mbelair@sbctc.edu. And so Monique can give you a hand because I'll be busy presenting. And lastly, chat questions will be addressed at the end of the webinar. So please know I'm not looking at chat. That box has closed for me now. But what we'll do is we will organize any questions that you post in the chat so that I can answer them as efficiently as possible. And at the end of the webinar, for folks who don't have access to the chat questions. So please be mindful of that. Please do not send chat questions to me privately, but when you go to send your chat message, make sure that you select that it's sent to everyone so that the folks moderating the chat can see your question. Otherwise, it might get skipped. So that's the housekeeping that I have available for you today, and we'll go ahead and jump into the meat of this webinar. Okay, and we pressed record. Awesome. All right, so to start off, again, I'm Jess Thompson. I'm a program administrator in Accessible Technology Initiatives here at the Washington State Board for Community and Technical Colleges. And if you have any questions for me after the webinar, the best way to reach me is at my email, which is jess.thompson@sbctc.edu. And chances are, if you're in this webinar, you've already received an email from me. So hopefully you have that on hand. So, and then just to kind of situate where I'm coming from, my background here is faculty. I was sociology faculty at Olympic College, and through that, started exploring accessibility with a really great team of people out at Olympic. And eventually that morphed into where I am now. So that's kind of where I'm coming from and kind of my background. But I've tried to make this webinar as kind of open to anyone in any position and not just faculty, because I know we have over 250 people registered, and I think the vast majority are outside of the higher ed system. So we welcome all of you to this webinar. So I want to kick off with a little discussion about the legal landscape and the laws and policies in place that support this work that we're doing. I don't start off with this in terms of it being the most important piece. Honestly, I don't think it is. I hope that people aren't doing this simply because they have to, but because they realize that it's the right thing to do and that this work benefits more than just people with disabilities, but it makes for a better experience for everyone. But the legal piece is always a nice kind of starting point. So the first piece of civil rights legislation that kind of came out about disability was Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. So when we look at policies that protects people with disabilities and ensure that they're not being discriminated against. This work goes back pretty far, maybe not far enough, but it's not as new as some people might think. Many of us are probably more familiar with the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the ADA has a few different sections that kind of impact our work. So we have Title I, which focuses on equal employment, and then Title II, which probably hits the vast majority of folks here in this webinar, focuses much more on non-discrimination in state and local government. So here looking at public entities. And then Title III focuses on non-discrimination in privately owned businesses and services that provide public accommodations and commercial services. So if you're at a private university, for instance, Title III would apply to you. And one thing that I don't have noted on this slide but is really important to point out, because a lot of us are probably here because of the kind of increased emphasis on web accessibility and accessible technology. Well, it was in 1996 when the Department of Justice said entities that fall within Title II and Title III, if they're using the internet to provide services or provide information, then they actually have to make those websites accessible to people with disabilities as they do with any other population or client that they serve. So we see that kind of emphasis that Title II and Title III of the ADA also applies to the internet has been kind of declared since 1996. So again, this is not very new. But again, I think a lot of people are here because of some recent state and local policies. And one of those, for those of us in the community and technical college system, happens to be the State Board Policy 3.20.30B on accessible technology. And this was approved in March of 2016, and basically said every aspect of our colleges, the services that we provide to students, to employees, to community members, needs to be accessible to people with disabilities. And that applies to current and emerging and future technologies. And then for those of you outside of the community and technical college system, we look at the OCIO Policy 188, which really kind of, I think, lit the fire, got everyone motivated because of some hard and fast deadlines to ensure that all covered technology was accessible for people with disabilities. And so I hear a lot of people say this is new, these new policies, these new requirements, but again, it's not that new. It's just that, unfortunately, the federal requirement hasn't been enforced up until recently. And part of that was the internet was a little bit of the wild, wild west. And now I think our work is fairly well rooted in technology and the internet, and so now it's time to really start paying attention to the ways in which we make our work accessible to everyone.
Right.
So some terminology before we get started, and this is helpful for those who might be new to accessibility. But first, let's talk about what we mean by accessibility. So the Office of Civil Rights definition of accessible means that individuals with disabilities are able to independently acquire the same information, engage in the same interactions, and enjoy the same services within the same time frame as individuals without disabilities with substantially equivalent ease of use. And so it's important to kind of see every aspect of that definition. So we're not just talking about, okay, we've made it accessible, but maybe it took us 3 weeks to do so, and the person still needs a, perhaps a sighted person to help them access it, which in that case means it's not accessible. So we want to ensure that kind of equivalent access and ease of use is part of what we're talking about when we mean accessible. And it's also sometimes, depending on who you're talking to, really important to make sure that you are giving them an accurate definition of accessible. I know when I was faculty and I was talking to a publisher sales rep, they wanted to tell me about a new online textbook that they were marketing, and I asked if it was accessible, and they said, well, it's online. It's available 24/7. And right in that moment, I realized they didn't know what I meant. And so sometimes it's good to have that definition on hand so that whoever you're working with can understand what you mean when you're asking if something is accessible. And another important term that I always like to cover is assistive technology, or AT. And assistive technology refers to software or hardware that people with disabilities use to increase or maintain functional capabilities. And the reason why it's important to understand really the existence of assistive technology is that sometimes it can be easy to focus on your assumptions about what someone can or cannot do based on their disability or condition. And this was the case for me. When I was faculty and I was told that I had a blind student enrolled in my hybrid course, which meant that all of the coursework was completed online, but we would meet face-to-face, I didn't understand how she could do the work. I had no knowledge of what a screen reader was. And luckily, the Access Services Office at the college explained to me that even though she can't see the computer screen, she'll be using a screen reader, which will read to her the text on the screen and will allow her to navigate our learning management system and therefore my online class. So it was not knowing or not being aware of assistive technology that really kind of fueled my ignorance, and therefore kind of led me to initially think that the student couldn't be in my class or shouldn't be in my class. So it's really important to recognize there's a lot of really incredible assistive technology out there that works to support people with disabilities. And when we're making something accessible, it means that we're making sure it's compatible with their assistive technology, that they're able to access it given the additional technologies that they may use. So never make an assumption about what someone can or cannot do because there may be a piece of assistive technology out there that blows those assumptions out of the water. All right, so the first real kind of practice piece I want to talk about here when we're looking at how to create accessible content and accessible experiences is universal design. And by universal design, I'm referring to creating environments that can be used to the greatest extent possible by anyone, regardless of their condition. And universal design started in architecture. And it was basically looking at how we can design a building, again, that anyone can access and use. And so we see examples of universal design, and we probably benefit from them on a daily basis. So one example is curb cuts. And that's where, you know, we cut out that section of the curb to make sure it's flush with the road so that someone in a wheelchair can easily cross the street without risk of, you know, tipping over. But people in wheelchairs aren't the only ones that benefit from curb cuts. So again, universal design really makes the space more usable for everyone. Someone on a bicycle will use the curb cut. Parents pushing strollers benefit by curb cuts. Someone on rollerblades or a skateboard, there's a variety of examples where curb cuts are beneficial not just for people with disabilities, but for a variety of users. And so other, you know, architectural examples, we look at elevators, for instance. Even if you are able to walk upstairs, do you want to walk up 17 flights of stairs? Or do you want to walk up 4 flights of stairs while carrying a load of boxes or pushing a media cart, for instance? So an elevator, again, serves more than just people with disabilities. And then a few other examples of universal design. Closed captions. I love closed captions. When I was using Facebook, I pretty much wouldn't watch a video unless it had closed captions. I keep my phone on mute. I typically use social media when I'm in public places and waiting in line for something, and I don't want to be that person playing music or audio out loud and disturbing those around me. So if a video has captions, then I'm much more likely to watch it. Same with, this webinar. We have live captions available in this webinar, and you might be a little bit like me. When I'm in webinars, I tend to check email. I get a little distracted, and sometimes I realize I missed a really important point. And if live captions are available, I'm able to pop in there and scroll back through to see what was discussed that maybe I missed, or maybe the presenter said something but you couldn't quite make it out. Again, popping over into the live captions can benefit anyone, not just people who are deaf or hard of hearing, or maybe your speaker's cut out and suddenly you lose audio. Popping into the live captions can help make sure that you can still follow along. So that's one example of, again, a service that sometimes people might think is just for people with disabilities, but really can benefit a number of us. Another example, I've impressed. I realize now I have an iPhone and I'm referencing Apple again. I promise I'm not selling anything. They're not paying me off. But Apple support, this always impressed me. Get help where you are. Choose a product and we'll connect you to an expert by phone, chat, email, and more. So sometimes universal design might make you reflect on your own communication practices. You might tell someone, okay, give me a phone, give me a call. And maybe they have a speech impairment, or they're deaf or hard of hearing. A phone call might not be the ideal method of communication. So thinking about how you can provide multiple means in which someone can interact with you is one example of universal design. Here's another one, which is, this is a little image of a broken image. And I can tell it's a broken image because I have an image icon with a line through it, and then it says dog walking. This is alt text. So that image is an image of a dog walking. And I know that because the alt text is there. So again, alt text, which we'll talk about in a few slides, is alternative text for images, and that provides a description of an image for someone who can't see an image. But again, it benefits all of us. If there's a broken image, that alt text at least lets us know what's there. And as someone that designs online courses, when an image of mine breaks and I have the alt text present, I'm able to easily go find that image or reproduce the image if it's a file that I've already deleted, because I know what it's an image of. And then the last example I want to give, if I'm on the right computer, there we go, is even PowerPoint, right? So like thinking about this webinar, you have visual supplements to what I'm saying. So we have a combination here of audio, but also visual. So getting at kind of different preferences. Again, live captions are also available during the presentation so that there's a text component too. All of that comes together to support universal design. And so that's something to think about with your own practices. Where can you kind of build in that choice and the multiple formats in order to support the diverse populations and preferences that we serve? So moving on from universal design, let's talk a little bit about how we organize documents or web pages. And what I have on the screen here is a screenshot of the first page of an old syllabus. And it says, the name of the course at the top in bold, all caps, social deviance. And then there's some course information that's kind of centered below that. There's instructor information, which includes the instructor's name, email, office, and office hours. We have, in all caps, it says required text. Required is underlined and red. And then underneath that, we have the text for the required textbook. Underneath that, another section title that's in all caps and bold, larger font that says course description. with some text below that describing the course. And so visually, when I look at this document, I can see where sections begin and end. There's a lot of visual structure built in by the use of larger fonts or bold font, and kind of the spacing between the sections. But all of this was done manually. So when I created this document, I just went in, I made the font bigger, I made it a little bit bolder, I changed it kind of on my own. And what that means is if someone was using a screen reader or text-to-speech technology, the way that they would have to navigate this document is a little bit more like the second image on the screen. And what that image is, it's all of the text from the syllabus, but it's all just strung together. So one word after the next, just one line. There's no kind of breaks between the sections. There's no bold, there's nothing to indicate where a new section begins and another section ends. It's just one long string of text. So if you have a document or a page that doesn't have that structure built in with the use of headings, then a user has to navigate it from the very beginning and listen all the way through until they find what they need. And in my course, my syllabus was about anywhere from 9 to 12 pages long. And the way life works, you can bet that student probably needed information on like the 11th page. So imagine what it's like to have to listen all the way through without kind of being able to jump from section to section. So we want to use headings, and headings are available in Word. Headings are HTML. We don't use headings in PowerPoint, but that's okay. We'll have a webinar on that. And then headings also transfer into tags and a PDF. So the way we use headings is headings are kind of ordered hierarchically. So the title of the document would have heading 1. And then the sections, the titles of each section would be heading 2. And so we have in this kind of image of a document, the title is marked as heading 1, and then we have 5 different sections, but 2 of those sections are nested under another section, so there's subsections, and those are marked as heading 3. So essentially, it's kind of like creating an outline to a paper, or and if you were to pull all of the headings together, it would create a table of contents. And it's actually quite simple for how to create these sections. So in Word, you would just highlight, your document title, and then select heading 1 from the Styles menu. Highlight the section titles, select heading 2. And you go through for all the sections that have the same importance. Subsections I would highlight, and then I would go and select heading 3. And again, it's quite simple. It's, merely, you don't even have to highlight the text. You can simply click, put your cursor on that line of text, and it will, it'll then, when you go to select the heading level, it will make that entire line of text that heading. And you can change the look of the headings. You can modify the styles to fit your needs. I personally do not like the default styles in Word. And so I change them up a bit to match what I would prefer, or to match the branding of the institution or agency. But again, this is really simple, and by doing that work, you're able to give your document structure in a way that someone using assistive technology can then jump from section to section, which visual users can do when those kind of visual styles are built in. Okay, sometimes you do need to change up the text in your document to accommodate headings. So I see a practice a lot in syllabi where someone will, mark, we've got kind of the course information. So course is bolded and underlined, and then it says SOCH 271. Section is bold and underlined, and then it says 3838. Credits, bolded and underlined, 5 credits. And so you don't necessarily want to get into the practice of taking anything that's bold and making it a heading, because in this case, it just wouldn't work. Headings have to be, it's one line of text. So what I might do to accommodate headings here is think about what's the text that's being kind of cordoned off into its own section. And that text is the course information. So maybe I would create text that says course info and nest the text underneath it, and I'd make course info a heading. I'd do the same with instructor info. I'd kind of pull that information out, make a heading that says instructor info, and then put the text that follows underneath. So sometimes you do have to make some semantic changes to your document or your web page to accommodate headings, but in all honesty, I think it oftentimes improves the look and organization of that page or document. Another important thing is to use real text. So avoid images of text. And this happens most often when people use scanned PDFs or they send out image-based emails. So we make a really beautiful, colorful flyer and then paste a JPEG of the flyer into an email and send that out. In those cases, those are just images. And so therefore, it's gonna, you're either gonna have to take a lot of time to add in alt text.
Jess, I just lost your audio.
Hey everyone, this is Jess. Sorry, it looks like my phone got dropped out. So hopefully you all can hear me now. Just popped onto a different account. So just have to bear with me. I'm going to be managing 2 computers now to make this happen, and I'm trying to move away from the talking in the background. I apologize. So
we got you. Good.
Okay, thanks. In order to know if text is real or not, or if it's an image, what you can try to do is use your cursor to select or highlight the text. And so I have a little screenshot here where I have a PDF and I ran the cursor across a few lines and I was able to highlight those lines of text. And so that tells me that that document is not scanned in, that it is in fact readable text. So that's one quick way in order to be able to kind of determine, are you dealing with an image of text or is it real text? Okay, so when it comes to alt text, which I was kind of referring to in the last slide, alt text is alternative text, and it's a short text description of an image. And short is key. It shouldn't be more than 100 or 150 characters. And you also want to keep the context in mind. So think about the purpose of that image. And a really kind of common example that we use around here is Mount Rainier. If I was teaching, a real estate, or not teaching, but if I was, doing real estate and had an image of Mount Rainier, I'm probably trying to kind of demonstrate what a gorgeous region we live in. And so my description might kind of describe, the city of Tacoma or, the port of Tacoma underneath a looming Mount Rainier, something like that. And that's going to be different than a geography teacher, a geology teacher, someone who might be using that image of Mount Rainier to kind of provide it as an example for a certain type of volcano. Geology is not my background, so I'm not sure which type of volcano that would be. But you always want to think about that context when writing the alt text so that it makes sense to the user why that image is present. And one of the tips about alt text in Office products anyways is that you add the alt text to the description box, not the title. And so if I'm in Word, I'm going to right-click on the image and select Format Picture, and then type my alt text into the description. The title piece we just completely ignore because the title doesn't always save and carry over if you're converting to a different format. And I've heard Microsoft is going to be getting rid of the title field entirely, so as not to kind of further the confusion. But again, it's quite simple. Right-click, Format Picture, select alt text, and type your description. And in the different webinars, we'll show the different ways to do this. It's a little bit different if you're on a website. You'll go into the code and enter the alt text. So, all right. So for media, you want to provide captions and transcripts. And the first tip I have to give you, if you're going to be creating any sort of audio or video piece, when possible, use a script. And the reason I say that is that, one, if you're going to make an audio recording and you're using a script, you automatically have your transcript. So you have a text version of the audio on hand that you can then share with users who can't access that audio. And for some of us, we prefer to read. It's much quicker for me to read through something than to listen. So in that case, again, looking at universal design and how more than just people with disabilities benefit, I'd prefer to just read a transcript than listen to the audio. For video, you want to provide captions, and I hope all of you are familiar with closed captions, but there's a few different ways you can do this. There's plenty of vendors out there that provide closed caption services, and their prices vary from about $1 a minute to upwards $2.50 or more, depending on the quality of the audio and the turnaround time. You can do it yourself. So this is something where YouTube, for instance, has a feature where you can go in, you can add captions, or you can edit the machine-generated captions, and it's not too difficult. But again, you can always upload the script, and that's something I really like about YouTube, is that I can then take my script and I can paste it in, and YouTube will automatically set the timings for me. They're not always perfect. I might kind of mess with them a little bit to fix it up, but there are a variety of different approaches you can use when it comes to captioning videos. The most important thing that you want to realize is that you should not rely on machine-generated captions. So if you're using a program like YouTube or any other video creating and editing software that creates captions for you, those are machine-generated, and that means there can be errors. So it's very important to always, if you're going to use machine-generated captions, go in and correct those errors because you really should be aiming for, at least 99% accuracy. A message can change dramatically, if one word is off or if if it drops the negative in the sentence. So I found this kind of funny example. This is an image of Dr. Phil from the infamous Dr. Phil show, and the captions read, "Nearly 62% of all American children are born with hooves and a full head of hair." I'm assuming that's not accurate. I'm assuming hooves is a mistake, but who knows? It's Dr. Phil. I'm never certain. So another piece of advice is to be very careful with color. The most common form of color blindness is the inability to distinguish between red and green. And so you want to find an alternative representation. And this might mean if you're making a a pie chart, you look at kind of the shading, or you use fill patterns that can kind of build in texture to the different pieces of the pie, and that can help make sure that the user can distinguish the sections so that you're not relying on color alone. Another option, sometimes if you've got a chart, is provide a list of rankings, and so that goes into the example that I want to show you. This was an image from FEMA that was noting counties that had been approved in some way and those that had been either rejected or expired, and they color-coded it with red and green. And knowing, it's FEMA, it's a federal agency, they, have accessibility guidelines that they have to follow. So my guess is that, there's probably some appendix that has a list of the counties that were all marked as approved and a list of counties where their, plan status had expired. And so again, they're providing two different ways in which to get that information so that we're not relying on color alone. All right, and then another important practice is to use descriptive hyperlinks. So I have on this slide, learn more at sbctc.instructure.com/courses/1559554/pages. I'm not even going to read the rest of it, and I apologize to our live captioner. So that's one. Visually, it's ugly. In terms of audio, it's ugly. It doesn't help in terms of telling someone where to go or where they're going to be taken. So if they're using a screen reader, then they have to listen through all of that to understand where it is they're going to learn more. Instead, what you want to do is embed that hyperlink into descriptive text. And so this is oftentimes what it looks like, where it says learn more at Accessible Design Principles. Accessible Design Principles is a different color. Usually hyperlinks are bright blue, but because of the theme of the PowerPoint, this one's more teal, and it's also underlined. And so there are visual cues built in to let someone know that this is a link that they can go to. But also, if someone is navigating with a screen reader, then they can kind of navigate through a page, and what they're going to hear is link Accessible Design Principles, rather than link sbctc.instructure.com/da-da-da-da. And so that's really important, because sometimes a user will navigate a website, especially if you have a lot of resources on your website that link out to other sites, then they want to be able to hear where it is they're going to go. And so that's also why you want to avoid saying things like click here or link. Because if I was using a screen reader and I was going to navigate by link, and you've gone through and you've embedded the hyperlink into text that simply reads link, then all you're going to hear is link, 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 link. And that's not going to be very meaningful. It's not going to tell you where you're going. So instead, if I had a whole list of different lessons here that were links, it might say learn more at Accessible Design Principles, or, accessibility in Word. If those were two different resources I wanted to provide, then you would get the names of each of those lessons and be able to kind of listen and hear to which lesson you want to go to. So that's kind of the trick with descriptive hyperlinks. And to just add a descriptive hyperlink, it's pretty simple in Word. You highlight it, right-click, and select hyperlink, and then type your address in the URL bar. And so again, you just highlight the descriptive text, right-click and select hyperlink, and then paste the URL into the address bar and press OK. Okay. And then really kind of my last piece of advice is to use programs correctly. Oftentimes, manual formatting or ignoring tools is what leads to inaccessible content. So again, in Word, for instance, or any Office product, when you're going in and you're bumping the font up, making it bold, making it underlined in order to designate a section title, you're manually formatting. You're ignoring the styles pane that can do that work for you, and the styles will build in that coding that allows someone to navigate by heading level. And so, oftentimes if people are adding in text boxes, for instance, that's probably going to create some problems because they're trying to override some of the tools that are present in these programs. So the upcoming webinars are going to be kind of introducing you to the tools that are already built into the programs that will help make more accessible content, but will also just improve your workflow. It actually makes for much more efficient workflow once you know how to use these tools. And so in Word, that's where you want to use headings and the formatting or layout tools. So if you're creating columns, for instance, you want to use the columns tool. You don't want to simply tab over to create a column. In PowerPoint, you want to use the layout templates that are available. That's the most important piece when it comes to PowerPoint, and we'll talk about how to do that in the webinar on PowerPoint. In PDFs, you want to use tags, and luckily if you're making documents in Word and you're using headings, then you can save that so that the headings convert over to PDF and are tagged appropriately. And that again will give structure to your document and make sure that someone is able to navigate it as a sighted person would. And with web pages, again, you want to make sure you're using headings for function, not for their look. That's a common problem that we see, where someone's made a section title heading 4 more because they like the look of heading 4 rather than the fact that maybe it should be a heading 2 or something like that. So, and there's ways that you can control the look of that heading if you're making a web page. So I guess actually my last real piece of advice is to put pressure on the vendors because in part they're providing or creating content and the applications and platforms that we use, but as the ones deciding to use them, we're the ones liable. So if you're using an inaccessible program and you're requiring your audience or your clients or your students to use it, you're now the one liable because you've chosen the inaccessible platform. And so that's where it's really important to recognize that we have buying power and we need to use it. We need to incorporate accessibility into every RFP and contract in order to ensure that the tools and services that we're using are in fact accessible, that they allow us access to the tools to make our content accessible. So that's a really big piece of this work. And I think it's also good because it means it's not just on us. You alone don't carry that responsibility. We all carry it, but we also need to share it with the vendors whose products we're using. And so again, there'll be a webinar that dives into that as well. So that is the end. We've got, let's see, just under 15 minutes to address questions. So I'm going to, let's see, actually, Monique, can you send me the link to the chat questions? Can you send them to me as Jess and not Jess Thompson? Does that make sense? Or Amy? If you can send it to me in the chat, that would be great. Thank you. Okay, so let's see what questions y'all asked. during the webinar and try to go through some of them. Oh, man, whoa. Okay, y'all asked a lot of questions. Okay. So bear with me. Let me start. Okay. So do you recommend all documents, either PDF or Word on the web, have headings? Yes. Yes, that is a, if I could respond in all caps, I would. That's, whether the Word document is placed on the internet or sent over email, it needs to have headings. Same with PDFs, because wherever you're posting them, someone's going to have to read them. Someone's going to be opening them in Word or Adobe, and they need to have headings in order to navigate that document. So that's pretty important. I don't know, I can't think of a time where I wouldn't want headings. Maybe if you're writing a formal letter to someone, because you're not, letters, you don't have sections so much, but even then I could probably find a way to justify adding headings. But always when you create a document, it should have headings. And then the next question I have, can you export modified styles for others to use? And this is also true. So you can modify those styles in Word in order to, give them the look that you want. Or maybe you're dealing with agency templates or institutional templates. You could create a style that fits your brand and then export those for others to then import. So that is possible. And if we have time, I don't know if we'll have time in the Word webinar to cover that, but I'll see if I can fit that in. And then, is it possible to make a PDF document accessible like a website could be? So here, I think this is in terms of, I guess I'd be asking, convert to HTML, or if you're just talking about adding headings. Because if you look at the tag structure of a PDF document, it's going to be somewhat similar to if you're looking at HTML. Where things are going to be tagged as heading 1 or paragraph text or, a list item. That tag structure is actually quite similar to HTML, and that's something we'll cover in the PDF webinar. And let's see the question, will we be getting the PDF or PowerPoint of this presentation? I will happily share that out when we share the recording. And let's see, if we have a very complicated figure, is it acceptable to put someone's contact information in the alt text? I understand the thought behind that question, but I'm going to say no. And that's because it means that we kind of have to return to that definition of accessibility. It means that the person with a disability now has to rely upon a sighted person. They have to go out of their way to contact a sighted person, probably during, set office hours in order to access information about that image. So when it comes to kind of that equivalent ease of access, we're taking that away. When it's, you need to now go out of your way to have a sighted person help you. So I understand the question. Sometimes that can seem like the best workaround, but it's best to avoid that. There are practices for adding in longer alt text, or sometimes you might want to think about if the text that the figure is accompanying already addresses the information in the figure, and that figure is just a supplement, it's just a visual representation of what's already in the text, then you might not have to do very detailed alt text. It all kind of, again, a lot of this, there's not always a right answer or one way to do it, but different approaches depending on what type of content you're dealing with. And so that's something where you have to kind of talk it through a little bit. So, okay, and the next question, for discussion, we've seen the word accessibility checker flag alt tags if the title was not entered. It ignored the description section. I have not had that happen to me. So you might want to look at the version of Word that you are using. The newer the version of a product, typically the more accessibility features, the better it is at accessibility. And so that could be a problem with an older version, but I've actually never had that problem. And with any automatic checker, I feel like my new mantra is be smarter than the machine. So practice this work enough and learn to know when these machines are wrong, because sometimes they are. And then, let's see, we had a comment from Ty. I always put a title, so if it's a picture of a koala eating bamboo in a rainforest, I put koala in the title and koala bear eating bamboo in a rainforest in the description. So yeah, that's one approach. Some people really just don't want to receive any errors in Word's accessibility checker, so they do everything it says. At some point, I'm just going to say all of you will be experts in this enough to not ever have to rely on the accessibility checker. But again, it's up to you. And let's see, someone else said, I'm confused. If there's no information in the title box for alt text, when the mouse is over a picture, it will not display any information. How is that helpful? So this all depends. There's a different code you're going to use on a website if you want the alt text to appear when hovering a mouse over. But if you're working on that Word document and you only put the alt text in title and you go to save it and convert it to a different format, that title will not always come over. And so that's why the rule of thumb is to put the alt text into the description box. Alt text is not meant to be visible. The idea here is that the image is visible, and alt text is there for someone who cannot see the image, either because they're blind and using a screen reader, or maybe the image breaks. Again, I showed you that example early on where the alt text displayed for where the image was broken. Okay, and so let's see, the next question, also about alt text. You gave the example of the real estate presenter using an image of Mount Rainier. Could you please talk some about times when it might be appropriate to leave alt text descriptions with a null attribute, which I'm not sure can be done in Word, but can be corrected in Acrobat after saving as a PDF. Yeah, there are totally times when something is purely decorative. It serves no value other than the fact that it's maybe pretty. And you don't want to waste someone's time by making them listen to alt text of, pretty fall leaf border around this. So in that case, it is better to do null alt text. And you can do that in Word. That's something we'll cover in the Word webinar. And it's basically a space and then a new line. So you press spacebar, enter. The word checker will flag it as a problem. But again, you're going to be smarter than the machine and ignore it. And then in HTML and the code for alt text, you would do 2 quotation marks. And that means when you do either that null alt text in Office or the 2 quotation marks in your HTML code, that means that a screen reader will totally skip over it. And that way, there's not even recognition that there's an image present. And so that's, again, important. If you don't do that, if you do not actively go in to put in null alt text, then a screen reader will say image. but it won't tell the user what it's an image of. So you always have to be active about alt text, whether you're putting in a description or you're using the null attribute. And again, that's something we'll be covering in all of the upcoming webinars, so you all will be able to see me do that. And then, let's see, does the reader provide the ability to the ADA user to link? I do not understand that question. So someone can, whoever asked that question, if you could either repost it in the chat, Monique will paste it in here for me. Otherwise, I'm going to keep moving. So when is it acceptable to use text boxes when it comes to when is it acceptable to use text boxes when it comes to accessibility? You know, if you can get into Acrobat Pro and you're comfortable remediating a PDF, you can definitely get content from a text box added in and make sure it's in the appropriate read order and all of that. So if you have to use PDFs, if you're going to be using PDFs, and if you know how to use Adobe Acrobat, then you're my hero, because that's not the easiest program, but that will kind of help in terms of ensuring that the text box is presented in the appropriate read order. And there are some tricks with PowerPoint as well, which we'll play around with. But again, in general, I'm just gonna say try to avoid adding more text boxes, especially if you're in PowerPoint and you're adding text boxes. Just create a new slide. You probably have too much information on that slide. But again, it all depends on context, but we'll explore that in upcoming webinars. Okay, so when someone's using a reader, does it prompt them to the link? So if you're using description rather than the real link. Yeah, so so you're talking about the descriptive hyperlink. It will tell them that it's a link. So just as for visual users, they can see that it's a link because it's blue and it's underlined. A screen reader will say link, and then the descriptive text that you've provided. So that's why you want to do the descriptive text. It will announce link. Okay, and then can you recommend any resources for making an existing template more accessible in Word? The Word webinar, but there also, we have public-facing accessibility lessons, which might get at some of the issues, and that's at bit.ly, bit.ly. Let me see if I can put it in the chat for you, bit.ly SBCTC access, all lowercase. And there's a lesson there on Word. In part, it's going to depend on what that template looks like, but I know in our agency, we've been working on that. So all of the new templates were sent out. We made sure we're accessible, but the users have to have a certain amount of knowledge to know how not to strip out those features. So you can't simply rely on a template. You also have to make sure you have trained users. And then the final question, can you please tell us a bit more about the captioning service that's being used for this webinar? Is it a private company? Is it computerized? I'm really impressed, but have no background information on captioning for webinars. Yes, so we are working with a company, ACS, and I'm blanking on what that stands for. Maybe something communication services, that we have a captioner here in the webinar who is listening to the audio, and then she's trained in providing live captions. So I'm going to assume that she might be using a steno machine, which is like what court reporters do, and then they're displayed on the stream text window. And with live captioning, you know, because you don't have that ability to go back and edit, there can sometimes be some inaccuracies. So we try to provide them with the materials from the webinar in advance, so that if I'm using funky acronyms or I've had people write my name as Jeff or Beth if they didn't have my name in advance. So you try to give them a glossary essentially beforehand so that they're familiar with any jargon that you might be using, and it kind of helps inform them as they provide the captions. But yeah, it's a really great service. I'm glad that you are impressed. And in general, for those interested, I find that about 12% of attendees have requested captions, and that's pretty standard. So good to remember if you are providing webinars out to the public that you can anticipate usually around 10% or so of your users might benefit from having captions. So webinars is not a webinar topic that we have, but we do have a lesson on accessible webinars available at those public-facing lessons that I posted in the chat. So, and that's at SBCTC Access bit.ly. So thanks for all of the great questions. We went over by about 5 minutes. I apologize, but we look forward to future webinars where we can dive into some of your questions a little bit more. And I'm sorry about the little audio dropout there in the middle and the noise in the background. We'll work on trying to eliminate that for future webinars. And in the meantime, thanks everyone just for showing up and for having an interest in making your materials more accessible.